This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. Simon Phipps and I will be talking to David A. Wheeler, Ph.D., about open source security. That's coming up next. FLOSS Weekly is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Securing every access point in your company doesn't have to be a challenge. LastPass unifies access and authentication to make securing your employees simple and secure, even when they are working remotely. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 609, recorded Wednesday, December 16th, 2020. Open Source Security. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. Like expired milk, 30% of your customers' data goes bad every year. That's money down the drain. Visit Melissa's developer portal for free access to data quality APIs, demos, and code samples. Freshen up your sour data today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. And by Expressvpn. Stop letting people keep logs of what you do online and protect your online privacy with one click. For 3 extra months free with a 1-year package, go to expressvpn.com/floss. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and I am co-hosted this week by Simon Phipps. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Doc. Greetings from a cold, dark, wet, virus-infested England.
Wow. Well, it's a warm, dry virus avoiding Santa Barbara, California here, where we can each take a piece of bread. We can make an earth sandwich out of it. So our guest this week is David A. Wheeler, Ph.D., whom I believe you know already. So, and we've already met each other offline, as it were. So,
yeah. So I mean, I know David because he's been on this show more often than either you or I have. That's to start with. Yeah. And then I also know David because David is the person who I would credit as being responsible for getting the US government to start using open source software. He wrote an essay back at the beginning of the 2000s that explained for all of the pencil-pushing people in the procurement departments that all open software is commercial software, that there's no distinction between commercial and open source, that all open source software is commercial software. And with that essay, he was able to propel open source software into the US government, and it's now fundamental to the way that America operates all of its state systems. I would say largely because of David's essay. And so I've known him ever since he did that.
It was a very thing. I remember when it happened, and I'd forgotten until now that David was involved in that. So look forward very much to talking about this and bringing David on the show. But first, I have to let you know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is, let me have to double check on this. Okay, these are out of order, so now I'm cool. Okay, this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. If you've ever forgotten to check the date on a carton of milk, you know that that milk expires. It goes bad. And like milk, your customer data also goes bad. In fact, up to 30% of customer data goes bad each year. Melissa makes sure your data is accurate and current so you reach the right customers. Their tools have helped business maintain fresh data for over 35 years. Don't throw money down the drain with bad data. You can verify addresses, emails, phone numbers, and names in real time with Melissa. Melissa's global address verification service verifies addresses for 240 plus countries and territories at the point of entry. This ensures that only valid billing and shipping addresses are captured and used in your systems. You can identify your customers and get to know them. Add consumer demographic information to your records, such as property and mortgage data, even marital status, or social media handles. Melissa's flexible deployment options offer different platforms to suit any preference, business size, or budget. With flexible on-premise web service, secure FTP processing, and software as a service, called SaaS delivery options, you can choose the best way to meet your unique business needs. Melissa continuously undergoes independent security audits to reinforce their commitment to data security, privacy, and compliance requirements. They have the utmost dedication to your data's security by implementing strong controls and safeguards when processing your data. And they are also SOC 2, HIPAA, and GDPR compliant. Over 10,000 businesses trust the address experts. And with the holiday season right around the corner, it's time to take control of your customer data. Trust Melissa to be your foundation for data-driven success. Melissa is supporting communities and qualifying essential workers during COVID-19 as well. See if your organization qualifies for 6 months of free service by applying online. So don't put up with sour customer contact data. Try Melissa's APIs in the developer portal. It's easy to log on, sign up, and start playing in the API sandbox 24/7. Get started today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. That's melissa.com/twit. Well, welcome and hello to our guest today, David Wheeler. He's the Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation and teaches a graduate course in developing secure software, not just any software, at George Mason University, from which he has degrees, including his Ph.D. He works on improving the security of open source software, such as serving as subject matter expert for the Linux Foundation's Open Source Security Foundation, the OpenSSF, and helping other foundations such as LF Energy and LF Public Health. And there's a whole long paragraph of stuff that he does, but and I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I'd rather have a conversation. So welcome aboard, David. Great to have you on the show again, because you're, Simon said earlier, you've been on here longer than either of us. Certainly you've been familiar to this show from appearances in the past, but I think this is your first one with the Linux Foundation, is it not?
That's right. I joined the Linux Foundation in April, and but this is time number 5 for me on FLOSS Weekly, and I of course I listen to FLOSS Weekly as well.
Wow.
No, I've actually we go later on. I can get the numbers, but this is time number 5. I went through the back records.
Oh wow! So that's on Twit itself, including. See, you're a polymath. You're a man of all shows.
Oh, that's just FLOSS Weekly. But I do all sorts of things. I'm a very curious person in probably both senses.
Well, and Simon was actually bringing up something earlier. So Simon, come on and direct this take this one a little bit deeper, because I remember. I'll just say a little bit more about it. I do remember how the U.S. was averse to open source because they loved paying too much money for software, not just money, but too much money to familiar companies, and then what actually happened.
Yeah. So as I recall, the problem was that the U.S. government had requirements that were kind of meant to make sure the software they got was good quality, and they required it to be of commercial quality. And procurement departments, particularly in the military procurement areas, were reading that procurement rule as requiring it to be commercial software, and saying that because you didn't have to pay for open source software, it wasn't commercial. Is that right, David? Is that
it's essentially right. It's probably useful to understand a little bit of the background here. U.S. government employees, like I suspect employees in many governments, they have a whole bunch of rules they have to follow, and so they try to understand the rules, and then they try to apply them. And when they looked at the rules, it would just say you should prefer, or in many cases you must use commercial software. And they looked at the open source and said, "What's this? I don't understand what rules to apply here. I understand how to use software the government developed internally. I understand how to use commercial software," and they were just very confused by open source. And so I went and did the digging in. Okay, what does the U.S. government define as commercial? And when I dug through and looked through, I discovered that in fact the definition of the term commercial under U.S. law and regulation is very, very broad. If it's licensed to the public, if it's leased to the public, or if it's sold to the public, it's automatically commercial. And in fact, there's a much longer list of other conditions, any one of which, if it's met, make it commercial. And I went and looked and went, wait a minute. Open source software is licensed to the general public. Therefore, it is commercial. And that revelation suddenly helped a lot of the government procurement offices and other government employees realize, oh, wait, instead of asking what rules do I follow, I know exactly which rules I'm supposed to follow. It's the same old rules, go. And I think that that helped break the logjam so that people could finally consider the software that the rest of the world was already starting to use.
So that's very much along the same lines as the whole reason why open source was successful in the first place, which is that developers are able to use the code without having to ask permission from anybody else. And by accident, the rules had made all the procurement people have to ask for permission, and so they didn't use the software. And so really what you did was you kind of applied open source magic to the procurement rules.
I would go further. The rules had already been set up to allow it. The problem is the people who were supposed to follow the rules didn't understand their own rules. And if you've ever imagined a printout of government regulations, they can go beyond the ceiling of a house and it's understandable why they didn't understand what the real world rules were. It's just somebody needed to help them understand their own rules.
Now, following on from that, the next thing that I've tended to hear from government procurement people is they say, how can open source software possibly be secure if everybody can see the source code? And I know that in the UK, our government security group wrote a paper indicating that there's really no question to answer. I think that you were involved in helping people gain more confidence in the security of open source software. Do you want to say something about how to persuade the government that open source software is no less secure than secret software developed by secret companies?
Well, how to persuade is a harder question. Especially since for some folks, they don't want to be persuaded. They have other reasons to make up their mind that has nothing to do with the actual issues. But let me focus on the actual issues. I think a lot of that comes down to a misunderstandings about open source. One which is, I think, common in the non-technical world, and it's very difficult for people who are in the software world to understand. But in a number of legislative bodies, I noticed this in the Texas legislature, for example, there's a very strange idea of, I guess, spooky action at a distance. In other words, if someone can take software and change it, that magically changes the software on somebody else's computer. And I think there's this fundamental misunderstanding that if I change software here, it suddenly changes without anything else over there is a problem in the non-technical world. Whereas, in fact, of course, people who develop software know very well that's not how it works. Anyone can change any software, not just open source. If you grab a hard drive that has Microsoft Windows on it, you can use something called a bit editor and change Microsoft Windows. It's not a problem. You just change some bits on a hard drive. That's not the problem. The problem is the supply chain. What you need to worry about is, what about the software that other people use? So just changing the software, anyone can do. The issue is, what's the software that other people eventually download through various supply chains?
Right.
Second issue.
Let's push on with that thought, because that's really where we want to go, because I think we're heading towards OpenSSF here. And I wonder what you think was the seminal moment when everybody understood that the issue wasn't whether bad people could change the source code, but whether bad people could change the source code in the supply chain. Was it Heartbleed? What do you think it was?
I think that's still in process. For software folks, they know this well. the problem is non-technical, especially folks who have nothing to do with writing software. Understanding supply chains is a whole new construct for them, and it's a challenge. There is a second point I want to quickly mention, though, and that's how do you develop secure software? The basics have been known since the 70s. There's a well-known set of design principles called Salter and Schroeder that's still just as true today as it was about, 50 years ago? One of those is open design. In other words, the security can't depend on design secrecy. So saying, oh my gosh, the source code's visible. Right, that's good. That enables review, peer review by others. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You want secrecy to depend on small, easily changed values, passwords, secret keys. That's what the security needs to depend on, not the source code being secret, not secret designs, because in fact that doesn't work. That certainly doesn't scale to a modern economy. But again, we keep having these arguments because there's a lot of people who aren't very familiar with software or how secure software is developed. And so we just have to keep making these explanations because it's a journey for a lot of folks.
Right. So the reason I brought up Heartbleed was really I saw that as the point when many of us in the open source movement realized that we were going to have to do something to support highly critical small components that were in the hands of brilliant people, but brilliant people who had other jobs. And that was the point really when Linux Foundation, I think, really first got the mission. So do you want to talk us through how Linux Foundation first realized that they ought to be involved in the idea of software security?
Well, I think that's a fair thing. I mentioned, that open design is important, but by itself, that's an enabler. That's a thing that enables you to be secure. I think we're all familiar with, people or projects that have great potential but don't live up to their potential. And the same thing is true for open design. It enables that review, that critique, finding problems and fixing them, but you then have to take the following steps. And it's not true that open source is insecure, far less secure than proprietary, because we're constantly updating proprietary software as well. But getting back to Heartbleed, Heartbleed was a major vulnerability in a particular widely used program, OpenSSL, and OpenSSL was just all over the place, and a lot of people weren't even aware that that OpenSSL was there, and the OpenSSL project had a lot of problems. And I think this basically was a wake-up call that some open source software is very secure, but some not so much. We need to get a handle on making sure that the open source we depend on widely is secure enough for purpose. So the Linux Foundation kicked off something called the Core Infrastructure Initiative, which worked to try to identify some of these important projects, tried to, it actually funded some of these projects to make various improvements. And much, much more recently this year, there's been basically kind of a follow-on foundation called the OpenSSF, Open Source Security Foundation, which I'm imagining we're going to be talking about here, which brings in the CII and some other projects as well, brings a lot of important organizations basically to all work on improving the security of the open source software that, in fact, we all depend on.
Yeah, right. We're inexorably heading towards OpenSSF, absolutely, and I know that Doc is girding his loins, ready to ask lots of questions about that. Doc, over to you. Go dig in.
I've had my lead underpants on for a long time. So you were involved in a census of open source projects with Harvard and the Linux Foundation, and that's headed toward a core infrastructure, the coreinfrastructure.org. And I have some questions about that after you tell us what that census was about and what it found.
Okay, well, just to be careful, there's two different things that are easily confused. There's a census and there's a survey. So there's a census of projects, and there's a survey of people. And I realize that can be a little confusing. So the census of projects, Harvard and the Linux Foundation worked on together, that was released in February 2020, where they tried to identify one of the most important projects that are widely depended on. They had some very interesting findings and also identified some challenges for doing that. One of the challenges that they had was there aren't really standardized names for projects. It's just because you say a given name like unzip, which project does that mean? It turns out there are several projects that can be referred to by that name that aren't the same project at all. There's a huge amount of what some people might call legacy open source software. This is open source software is not as maintained. People will say, hey, please use this other thing instead. But there are literally millions of programs that depend on that software anyway. And we either need to help them transition or help make sure that older software continues to be improved, that we need to check it for security. I have a sticker that a friend of mine made a while ago that I think is funny. I think we should all consider when we're building software, we are building the legacy systems of tomorrow. My credits to John Scott on that. And we also much more recently did a survey of people, the contributors to open source software. I should say, the projects that it found, a lot of them were actually very, very low level kinds of things, like in the JavaScript world, things like isArray and async. It's just all over the place. And that matters because if any of those was, for example, subverted, say the developer's account was subverted, that could easily lead to attacking a huge number of folks. So, so that was an interesting thing in the survey. And then we can, if you want, we can talk about the survey or something else if you want to talk about that.
Well, here's a kind of a sideways question, and it's something that coincidentally I was in a conversation about yesterday, and it has to do with peer review. You were mentioning earlier. If I could compress what you were saying a little bit, it was kind of that open source software is kind of inherently peer reviewed, and at the very least is open and is subject to peer review, and yet there are these dependencies that we have, including on companies that are in the core infrastructure initiative, notably Facebook and Google, that are black boxes in terms of what they do algorithmically. And so I'm wondering if you see a way into that, if you see the possibility of these companies opening up what they do algorithmically. And I'm not sure this may just be a rat hole we want to avoid, or it may be a subject of some importance.
Well, I can't speak for those companies. So I what they do internally and don't reveal to the public, I can't tell you either. That said, I think when a lot of people talk about the dependencies, they're not talking about secret sauce, proprietary black boxes. We're talking about open source in many cases that depends on other open source that depends on other open source. And I think the phrase you used is a good one. It's potentially peer reviewed. But potential or something, words to that effect. I mean, potential is great.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Actually I don't remember. It's something like that. Potential is great, but then you need to take advantage of that. And if you depend on another project, one of your questions should be, is anyone looking at that? Can you tell that other folks are looking and, making improvements? And, are there ways, is it taking steps? And so I think a lot of that, that's not subject to black boxes. And, even for things like, for example, GitHub is itself a proprietary service, but it relies on Git, which is absolutely open source. All the source code that you download from GitHub is absolutely, well, not all the open source that you download from GitHub is by definition open source. So, there are black boxes, but that's not the problem that I think a lot of folks are talking about when they're talking about open source software security. They're talking about making sure that we really do review that open source, that people who develop it know how to develop secure software, that any problems found are quickly fixed, and that kind of thing. And I think there's a lot to be done there, but there's also pretty obvious paths forward that people are already taking.
Okay, so there are lots of different branches we can run down here, and we've only got an hour, and so so you and you've been on here before, and well, let me just take one of the topics we've got here, which is the edX course, Secure Software Development Fundamentals. My question about that is, what's changed, and what changes constantly? Because the world isn't what it was 10 minutes ago often, and but you're dealing kind of at a lower level. But how's that going?
Well, first of all, the edX course is something all secure. Let's see here, Secure Software Development Fundamentals. It's free. If you have not already taken a course on how to develop secure software and you develop software, please take that course, some other course. That course, really, it's not a big commitment, an hour or 2 a week for 5 months, if you want to take the entire set of 3 courses end to end. And it's really easy to get going and get started. You say, hey, things aren't like they were 10 minutes ago. Well, yes and no. A lot of the security stuff is actually it's the same old stuff since the 1970s. Languages have changed, same problems for the most part. Probably, the newest, and I put that in scare quotes, are some of the web development things, but most of that stuff is the same stuff since the late 1990s, early 2000s. Sure, there's been a lot more JavaScript. JavaScript's changed. There's lots of other things, but a lot of the security fundamentals really are the same old things as from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And that's what the course focuses on, is those fundamentals. And the odds are very, very good that most of those fundamentals will serve you well in the next 10, 20 years too, because they are the same old. A lot of them are, common mistakes everybody keeps making. Well, if you knew what they were, you would know how to counter them, but nobody tells the developers what they are. So it's true that some things change, but the course very much focuses on the key stuff that doesn't change or has changed very, very slowly. And that makes it valuable for people. Once you do this, you can just keep going. And, the courses themselves are free. If you want to prove that you learned the material, there's for pay, you can get a certificate. A lot of edX courses work that way. But please, if you develop software, learn how to develop secure software. Most of the schools aren't teaching it. So you need to grab courses like this or others to get that important knowledge.
So we have a whole bunch of questions backed up here, but first I have to let you know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Expressvpn. Earlier this year, more than 100 Twitter users got their accounts hacked into. Passwords, email addresses, phone numbers, and more, all taken from high-profile people. These kinds of attacks are getting more frequent and more severe. And it's not just Twitter. Facebook, eBay, Uber, Adobe, and Yahoo have leaked data such as passwords, credit card info, and driver's licenses belonging to billions of users. And that's why I and pretty much everybody here, as far as I know, at Twit, use ExpressVPN to safeguard personal data online. According to recent reports, hackers can make up to $1,000 from selling someone's personal information on the dark web, making people like me and you easy, lucrative targets. ExpressVPN is an app that funnels your data through a secure, encrypted tunnel so that no matter what device you use, you can have peace of mind every time you use the internet. The app connects with just one click, is lightning fast, and the best part is ExpressVPN works on up to 5 devices simultaneously, so you and your whole family can stay protected. If a breach can happen to powerful individuals, it can happen to you. Protect yourself with ExpressVPN, rated #1 by CNET, Wired, and countless others. And I should add, by the way, that the basic thing for me is just the speed of it. I've used other VPNs before, and none are faster. So if you visit expressvpn.com/floss right now, you can arm yourself with an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. That's expressvpn.com/floss. Visit expressvpn.com/floss to learn more. Okay. So Simon, I think Simon, you had a backed up that we were talking about in the back channel. So
yeah, I'm poised and ready. So that ad read we just had brings to mind the fact that the U.S. government has just been hacked, and a provider called SolarWinds was the gateway for a cyber attack into the U.S. government. It doesn't appear to have been a mistake the U.S. government made. It was something in their software supply chain that got them. And it seems that the real issue now is that open source software is now just the way people make software. And the real question now is, how do we make software secure rather than is open source software secure? So the question I have for you, David, is you are the director of open source supply chain security for the Linux Foundation. Is there really any difference between open source software and proprietary software when it comes to the measures that you need to take with securing your software supply chain?
That's an interesting question, because you can say both no and yes. No, in one sense. A lot of the stuff is exactly the same in terms of, design. How do you design? How do you implement? How do you figure out what the software is supposed to do? How do you test? Using tools to analyze the software, say in your CI, making sure you've got tools in your CI pipeline, and so on. All that's exactly the same between open source and proprietary software. And the edX course we just mentioned, the Secure Software Development Fundamentals course, that actually applies whether you're developing proprietary or open source software, because all those things are the same. What's different is some of the how do you apply, and in particular for open source software, how do you enable mass peer review? Because that's one of the potential great strengths of open source software, is that in proprietary software, because of the way the business model works, you can't show off and get mass peer review. And that's a potential big disadvantage for proprietary software. But for open source software, it's possible to have the mass peer review, but you need to take steps to enable it so that people can actually review it, so that their comments get fed back, and so on. And there are a number of steps that can be taken to help achieve that. I've talked about this before, but I think it's important because I don't know that all your listeners have heard me talk about before. If you are involved in an open source project or potentially using one, please go to the CII Best Practices badge site and start working on a badge for your open source project, because we've actually identified a number of criteria specifically for how to improve how to make the security of your open source software better. Number of steps to take. A lot of them focus on enabling that mass peer review and enabling the potential advantages of it. So if you hear nothing else, please go do that. Costs nothing. Won't take more than half an hour of your time generally. And I think it's very, very valuable for projects to find out where they're doing well, things they're not doing that they should be doing, and then they can figure out, well, which ones do I want to work on, if any. Right. You don't make people make changes, but a lot of projects, once they find their weaknesses, say, oh yeah, we probably should be doing, we should be making tests. We should be using a tool to look for problems. And they fix that, or whatever the problems are, and voila, they get a badge.
Right. So I've always felt that when it comes to talking about open source security, the truth is that you're probably at far more risk from the software that's created in a private laboratory by a private company in a foreign country than you are from open source software that has actually been peer reviewed. And the only real question that is, has it been peer reviewed? So what are you doing in OpenSSF to make sure that open source software is getting peer reviewed? Are you paying reviewers? Are you incenting them in some other way, or is this about an industry looking after its self-interest?
Well, it's not about an industry looking about its self-interest, at least in the sense that, I think everybody does work in at least partially in their self-interests, but their self-interests also help everybody else. and that's a good thing. We want to encourage setting up situations where parties with self-interests end up helping everyone. And the OpenSSF is hopefully an example of that, where people have gotten together. They all agree we need to improve the security of open source software because it's under attack. And then we all benefit from the results. Let's see here. So there's actually the OpenSSF. Let me give, first of all, quick shout out to its URL, openssf.org. If you go there, you can quickly click on various things. You can find out its membership and, current membership and various activities it's doing. Like a lot of the Linux Foundation, basically is a foundation that creates foundations, and the OpenSSF is another foundation. Its focus is on improving security of open source software. And they've identified a number of working groups. Each of those working groups is working on different aspects and different issues. So, for example, the Best Practices Working Group is focusing on identifying best practices, getting education out there. So that's, for example, where that edX course shows up. And also getting people to identify and get their projects to use the best practices. That's where that CII Best Practices badge has actually been recently moved into the OpenSSF as part of that Best Practices Working Group. And there's other folks, too, who are working on different aspects of things like, how do we improve vulnerability disclosure? How do we, share, metrics across broadly lots of different open source projects? So, if you're interested in improving the security of open source software, I would certainly encourage you to go check out the OpenSSF, see what you're interested in. They have, most of the working groups have meetings every other week. They've got emailing lists, they've got Slack channels. So, go get involved, find out if it's of interest, and go from there.
I want to take it up a level.
Okay.
To the Linux Foundation itself. Since I got here in May, the only other person we've talked to online about it is Brian Bellendorf with the Hyperledger Foundation.
I know Brian.
Tell us more. Yeah, and a friend for all of us, I think. But I think I wrote for Linux Journal for a quarter century, and the Linux Foundation really only got huge right at the end of that. But it seems to be getting huger. But it's very careful about what it takes on. It's sort of like a rolling stone that only gathers the right moss. But it's a bigger stone all the time. And I'm wondering if you could, for our audience, which I think has a lot of Linux users in it, what can you tell us to just go up a level to the Linux Foundation itself, and tell us kind of how it works, how it adds foundations within it, projects within foundations, stuff like that, and how to get involved if possible or whatever. Sure.
I can at least give a very high level view. We don't have time to go into all that, but the Linux Foundation, you can tell from the name, one of its key things that was started with originally was, lots of folks depend on the Linux kernel, but there was a big concern if Linus Torvalds worked for a particular company that might be a competitor to other companies. It would have been very awkward to have, one of your key components depend on a competitor. And so the Linux Foundation was created, and there's actually more to its history than this, but one of the reasons it was created was to create basically a way for there to be a common, not under any particular company's control, place where people can work together on the Linux, on important projects like the Linux kernel. So for those who aren't familiar with how the Linux kernel is developed, there's a huge number of people who develop it, many of whom work for different companies, many of whom work for competing companies, and that's fine. But they all work together to collaborate to develop the kernel, and then folks like Linus Torvalds and Greg K.H. Then work to create that final release that then goes out to various folks who can then use that as the basis for whatever they're doing. And that general model of creating a commons area to turns out to be really valuable for lots of other kinds of situations. And so at this point, the Linux Foundation is essentially a foundation of foundations. If somebody has a broad problem that they want to deal with, it's often what the Linux Foundation will do is create a foundation, then create working groups and projects within that foundation that then work to try to address the problem. So, for example, the OpenSSF is a foundation designed to improve the security of open source software. Another more recent one is LF Public Health. It's focused on developing software to help counter pandemics. I wonder why we did that. And so basically this idea of creating a foundations so that different people, different companies, nonprofits, individuals can all work together to help develop the software that we all depend on. And yeah, you can just create an open source software project on GitHub or GitLab or somewhere else, but that doesn't give you governance necessarily. A lot of things that it doesn't create a legal entity, which a lot of companies need. Doesn't create a framework that helps ensure that antitrust rules and regulations and laws are followed, which a lot of companies are very, very worried about. And so basically the Linux Foundation works a lot like a standards body, but instead of just developing specs, it also develops code. And I'll note that LF actually can also develop specs and submit it as a publicly as a pass. I forgot what the A stands for, but anyway, it has developed documents, specifications that become standards because those two standards and open source software actually work really, really well together. So hopefully that gives you kind of the bird's eye view. And you're right, lots and lots of more, because I think this model works. It helps enable lots of different people to collaborate on the things where they don't need to compete on, a line in the. Do I need to compete on the Linux kernel itself? No, we can work together in commons on that, and then compete on services and products that use that as a starting point, or just use it for advances of humanity. Lots of important scientific work is based on Linux Foundation software. So I hope that hasn't been too long an answer, but I hope that gives a general sense of what the Linux Foundation is about.
It's a very complex entity, the Linux Foundation, and I noticed that in the area where you're involved in core infrastructure or in supply chain, there's at least 3 that you seem to be involved in, that Linux Foundation are involved in. There's Core Infrastructure Initiative, there's OpenSSF, there's OpenChain. You mentioned that the Linux Foundation is now working with Joint Development Foundation to submit standards to ISO, and it's put in the OpenChain spec into ISO recently.
Yes, just got it.
So this whole area seems to be a big focus area for Linux Foundation, and it's surprising that there are so many different foundations rather than just one organization that I can handily subscribe to that looks after supply chain and security, which all of these things seem to do. Why are there so many of them?
Scale, frankly. I'm sure we talked briefly about the U.S. government. And I don't want to cast too much shade on some of the folks who work for the U.S. government who, are doing their best, and there's some really good people there. But when you get a large organization, it can be really, really hard to be nimble. The U.S. government, nimble is not the first word that comes to mind when you talk about the U.S. government. And so I think the goal of creating foundations within the Linux Foundation and then working groups and projects within it are all so that it can quickly break down to much smaller teams that can move in a much more agile and nimble way to focus on a very specific problem. And if you want to work on a different problem, great. Let's talk about doing something else with that. Security is actually an interesting cross-cutting kind of problem. the OpenSSF is not there to rewrite everyone's code. Okay, that is not what the OpenSSF is about. The OpenSSF is trying to work on cross-cutting problems and challenges that hit everybody, and then helping other foundations and other projects to secure their work. And you mentioned a number of foundations too. The other ones that I've been involved in particular, are Linux Foundation Energy and Linux Foundation Public Health. In both of those cases, it's not that security is irrelevant to everybody, to all the other ones, but energy and public health, as you can imagine, have a number of very especially important security issues. And so I only have limited time. And so those foundations are foundations that I've in particular interacted with, trying to help them get going to improve the security of what they're working on, specifically because the security issues are so critical. So, for example, the LF Public Health, we just released security audits of the 2 exposure notification open source applications. Both are used in multiple locations, and they found some problems, and of course they've already fixed the key ones, and they noted some other issues that are compensated by the controls that are used within that government, but other governments use that software would need to know about so that they can just deploy the software in a secure way as well.
Right. So that brings to my mind the next question for me in looking at OpenSSF is really the issue is less about evangelizing open source these days. That's what we all did, 20 years ago. Look at the beard.
Right.
Really, today the question is about making it objectively verifiable that people have been following the correct processes that are likely to have led to adequate peer review, and that peer review had a positive outcome. So that seems to be what the open chain standard that's now at ISO is all about doing. It's about carrying those indicators forward from entity to entity in the supply chain. What are the tools that OpenSSF is using? Is it things like repeatable builds and being able to verify repeatable builds? Is it things like attesting the identity of participants in the supply chain? What are the objective things that OpenSSF is doing to make the open source supply chain safer?
Well, a number of things, but let's be fair to the OpenSSF. They only started existing a few months ago. So I think
you've had loads of time. It should all be done by now.
It all should be done by now. And the OpenSSF is pulled in the CII Best Practices badge, which of course pre-existed. We already got an educational course out. I think that's pretty good stuff. You mentioned digital identity attestation. That's actually one of the working groups. I probably maybe I should just read off the working groups because some people may want to know. Here are their current working groups: vulnerability disclosures, security tooling, security best practices, identifying security threats to open source projects, and that's really focusing on metrics, securing critical projects, and digital identity attestation. And that last one is about, how to verify when someone says, I did this. How can you verify that, in fact, the claim that they make is actually true? And I will say that right now, that group is basically in a whole sequence where people are presenting and proposing various approaches. I know, I'm not telling any grand secrets. There's a particular effort that Hyperledger and some other folks have been involved in to try to build on OpenSSH and Get to try to improve this sort of thing. So they're at this point, they're analyzing what exists now before they step off in a direction, because it's always good to make sure that you understand the landscape before you jump in and try to do things. So they're at that stage right now, but I can say that already they've gotten lots of interesting results. Lots of people have presented a lot of the things that they're doing so that they can move forward with a lot of good information. You mentioned repeatable builds. Right now, the OpenSSF isn't directly doing anything with repeatable builds officially. However, that's already on the list, what we call the wish list. There's a long list of things that could be done. the Linux Foundation actually funded quite a bit of the reproducible builds work in years past. So while I can't speak for the OpenSSF, it's a foundation, and so members decide what the foundation's going to do. That's kind of the point. The Linux Foundation enables foundations to create, and the members of the foundations then decide what they're going to work on. That includes anybody who works in any of the projects. But I think that reproducible builds has certainly been discussed as a potential key thing to be working on in the future. So I would be unsurprised to see that added to the set of things that are worked on. But let's give OpenSSF a little time to work and stand on its feet. And if you're interested in helping on that sort of thing or helping the OpenSSF, please go check out that link and go get involved, because those who are involved decide what gets done.
Right. And so do you think that it's going to be likely you'll be using Linux Foundation's new standards body, JDF, to propagate standards for open source security into ISO?
I don't know is the honest answer. It certainly has been discussed briefly. I think let me just kind of step back on. I have been involved, of course, in a number of standards bodies over the years. I think you're well aware, for example, that I was a participant in the open document format specification. In particular, I led the work on the spreadsheet formula standardization. So, I'm certainly and I've been involved in POSIX and many other standards work in various capacities. So I'm no stranger to the standards process. I think that there are some people who like to create a spec, make it standard, and then implement it. I think that is a terrible idea. Okay? Standardizing things that you don't know whether or not they will work is a shockingly bad idea most of the time. I was around for the fight between the internet TCP/IP standards and the OSI standards. And there's this huge stack of paper for, here are all these protocols for a network. And all these people were meeting in meetings, but nobody had built anything. And as we know, and governments tried to force the use of this thing that nobody had built yet. And we all know the outcome. The outcome is that TCP/IP with the internet standards all won because they worked. And they focused on making it work. And yes, they needed to write specs, but they were built on real experience. So I think that the OpenSSF might very well create specifications and then submit them for for formal standardization. Make de facto standards and then work to make them de jure standards. But I think that needs to be built on the idea of experience, so that we avoid, here's a spec, I'll make it a standard, then I'll find out if it works. The answer is almost never yes.
So I have a question that, now that we're coming down toward the end of the show, we've got about 4 minutes left, actually about education versus schooling. And when I look at your CV, so you got your bachelor degree in electronics engineering, which used to be called electrical engineering.
They're different now.
They're different now. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can expand on that if you want. A master's in comp sci with a certificate in infotech security, and then a Ph.D. in information technology. There's something there that's almost like how education changed in the course of your advanced schooling. As you're getting an advanced degree, but now this year, with the plague hitting and everybody getting education from home, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how all of that is changing, both institutionally and also for the hackers of the world that are busy making this world, that are, on which we all depend. And just as a little anecdotal thing, I remember a number of times when I was working for Linux Journal asking a room full of hackers, who here learned what they do in school? And most of them did not. They were self-taught or taught by each other or taught on, scratching their own itches. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how the institutions on which we depend are changing or need to change.
or need to change? Wow, big question. I wish we had more time. I think that's a huge and important topic.
Or less.
Yeah, 3 minutes. Yeah, maybe you need to bring me on for another one.
We're in the habit now.
Okay. So I teach 2 graduate courses at George Mason, including how to develop secure software. I will admit, by the way, in spite of the fact that I've got all these degrees, I am officially a doctor. Usually people only use that title when they want to, yank my chain. And yet, if I said, what did I learn? Almost everything that I learned is actually self-taught. But that doesn't mean that degrees are useless. I think degrees can be helpful in filling in the gaps. For example, I did a ton of software development, but it wasn't until I took a course on developing compilers that I truly understood much better how compilers work and how to write my own. I had learned a little bit about lectures and stuff before that, but I think schools and a more formal education and even and curricula like the edX course, having someone work out what is important to learn and work out a straightforward, here's the information in a form that's easier to consume is valuable, and even more valuable today. We are overwhelmed with information. It is easy to Google a particular question, but it's much harder to figure out what questions to ask and what is important. And so I think having formalized, bite-sized, this is the important information, here's a logical sequence to learn it, is still just as important and even more important than it was in the past. So I think schools can serve a vital role in doing that. I think expecting schools formal to fill all educational needs is not really reasonable. They didn't before. No reason to think they would do now. But I think they have a vital place, particularly in things like I want to develop secure software. That's not something we can just teach a few people. All software developers need to know nowadays how to counter attacks because we're all now connected via the internet. So everybody's writing software that's connected in some ways or another to an attacker. So we all have to learn the basics. If we're going to develop software, we need to learn how to develop secure software. And that's where I think a lot of these things. Now, have schools had to change? Of course they have. Will they need to continue to change? I'm sure they will. We're seeing more use of, obviously, video conferencing is now a thing. We're seeing more use of technology, but I think that was happening anyway. I think this just accelerated certain trends. And I think the education system will continue to make adjustments, perhaps not as quickly as we would like them to, but there's an important role for them to play.
So we are in the final section of the show, and we have 4 questions. The first is there any question we haven't asked that you can answer in a very short time?
Yes, do the set difference. Set difference is hard, especially on the fly. So let me just try to do a quick recap, I think, which is, if you are developing open source at all, or contributing in any way, please get your projects involved in the CII Best Practices badge. That's at bestpractices.coreinfrastructure.org. It may eventually get renamed. We're talking about maybe changing CII to OpenSSF. But I don't know if we'll actually do that. It's a pain to rename, and some people are saying, why bother? But regardless, please get a badge. I think that's a very, very helpful thing. If you're developing software, you're actually a developer, take a class in how to develop secure software. There's a free one on edX. I think it's a good course. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but other people have said that's a great course, so hopefully you will too. It won't take a lot of time, and it's important. It will be important for the rest of your life. If you're interested in improving the security of open source software, take a peek at OpenSSF.org. OpenSSF.org, just go check out what they're up to. Now is the time, if you want to influence what they're doing, get involved and say, hey, we should be doing this, and I would like to help. That is really the best way to get the OpenSSF to do something, is to help. There we go. Look at all those flying geese. Oh, and here's an example. There's swag. The goose is their symbol. So here's a little goose there, a plushy goose that you can get on their marketing site. So, and by the way, a quick plug. If you know other languages other than English, you're a native speaker, we're always looking for translators for the CII Best Practices badge. So I just talked to two people who are willing to help me, improve the Chinese translation. So I'd love to chat with you about that. So shoot me an email, dwheeler@linuxfoundation.org. Love to chat. Okay, so hopefully so thank you.
Well, we're over time now, so I'm going to actually skip the blockchain question and go straight to what is your favorite text editor and scripting language?
I still like Vim. I like Python and Ruby. I certainly do a lot of shell scripting.
Excellent. Well, David, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been fantastic, and we will have to have you back because there's so much more that's left unsaid. So thanks for being on the show. It's been terrific.
Thank you very much.
So, wow, Simon, that was a whirlwind. So what's left unsaid for you, if anything, on that? And we don't have a lot of time. We've been told on the back channel. So
I think it's a very notable week that for the first time there's an international standard that is about open source. ISO approved the open chain specification this week, and it's got some ISO number that I can't remember. But for the first time, open source is so mainstream that the incredibly late adopting ISO has now got a standard that it's got it in the name and that is all about its integrity. And I think that's a key landmark. And what we've been talking about here today has been indicative that open source is now the way we do software. And it isn't external, freaky, it isn't subversive. It's just the way we do software. And I think that we're now at a point in the history of technology where open source is the way you do things, and it's the people, and there are still some people, I see them at standards bodies to do with the mobile industry, there are still people who think open source is in some way subversive or trying to steal their precious. But nonetheless, I think open source this week became totally mainstream. It crossed the bell curve into the late adopter section. And I think that's very notable. And I think that was the subtext behind everything we've been discussing.
Yeah, I think I remember back in the early days, even in the early 90s or mid 90s, thinking that eventually open source is going to become the norm and the proprietary the exception. I think we've moved there. Anything you want to plug before we move on? Yourself?
Not really. I can't really get most people to come to my new restaurant, so we'll have to plug that in a future week.
Stand in the street. We'll throw you some food. Well, thanks so much for being on, and thank everybody for being with us. Next week, we have the Toy Box project on, which is a really interesting project. We've had some feedback on the show urging us to do more projects, and so we have a project on next week. So thank you very much, everybody, for being with us, and we'll see you next week on FLOSS Weekly.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Ant Pruitt, host at Twit TV. Got a question for you. Have you gotten tired of how bad your photos are looking every time you post them to Instagram? Better yet, have you gotten yourself a new camera and you can't quite figure out why the images just don't look that good? Well, I have a solution for you. This is my show, Hands On Photography. Each and every Thursday, I sit down and share different tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer and a better post processor. So subscribe today at twit.tv/hop to learn more.